Hello, I'm Breach, and welcome to our Monday live stream. This one could end up being a somewhat interesting one. I've noticed just about 5 minutes before I was going to start, I've noticed that they are out marking where the gas lines are in the street, and they are actually repaving my road this week, which I have no complaints about. I have been wanting them to do this for years and years now because frankly, they did every other road in the town, and ours, basically, it looks like you've landed on the moon. I mean, it's cratered everywhere, and everybody, I mean, if I'm outside, I have people stop me and go, is that going to do anything about this road? I'm like, I'm not zoning, and I'm not, I'm not the town engineer. So I don't know. But finally, we gotten the letter that they're going to start doing it. And they've been working pretty much on the other end so far, but I noticed the guy has stuck his bag that he's working from right in front of my mailbox. So yeah, they could be down here and hopefully there won't be any interruptions. But if there are and I have to cut things short, then, so be it. Just some of the updates for Chthonia for this week. I think, I posted on Sunday, I think it was, it would have been yesterday, that I now have the links for Project Lethe, which is my new book that is coming out. That is due out Wednesday, actually. So today's Monday. It will be coming out officially Wednesday. The pre-order link is up for that. And I've also added it to the Chthonia website. Chthonia website, I was looking at it the other day when I was looking at my publications page. And the thing is, other than in the banner, I don't really have any images of the books. And that was because it's something about WordPress. Every time I tried to put in a thumbnail image, it wanted to make it huge. I couldn't, it wouldn't let me put a small image in. And you can't, it's not scroll friendly to go through a list of titles and descriptions and have just these massive images in there. So eventually, after fighting with it for quite a long time, I gave up on it. So at some point, I feel like I need to go back and maybe figure out how to do that. I'm also working on, I'm trying to I really truly need to boost my business with transition life coaching, and I have not been spending enough time on that channel. I've had so many other things going on, and I am also completely trashing and rebuilding that website. So there's been so many things. I've got an editing project, which is fine. There's no issue with that. Finishing up the semester, I have students handing in final papers today, so that's going to be really joyful. And we'll see how that goes. And then I've got final exams to grade in a couple of weeks. And I'm probably looking for another steady source of income for the summer. Preferably something kind of more in the mindless category. Something that I can do from home and that, I can do it sort of on my own hours. So that I don't, just to have something to fill in because I don't have a check again from the university until September. So... and it's too unreliable. Some months I have a fair amount of business, other months I have hardly any, and summertime has been sort of slow traditionally. So, so I've got all of that kind of stuff on my mind right now. So I may have to, turn some attention to that. I have listed some things on Upwork, but I really need to get the website sorted out. And I do have some other books coming out, as I had mentioned. And of course, the merch store is live. The link to that is in my bio on Instagram, and if you're watching this on YouTube, then I also have the link down below to, I believe it's actually sort of in the tray underneath. They've now linked to my spring store, and so things like t-shirts and mugs and stuff are available there with the Chthonia podcast logos, both of them, the woman logo and the crow logo. So that's about all I have in terms of updates for the moment. Now, the big update, really, I guess, is the new podcast that came out today, and that is on Agdistis. Now, Agdistis is a hermaphrodite, is a daemonic hermaphrodite. Now, some dictionaries of myth will refer to Agdistis as a Phrygian goddess, which is also correct. Because the myth of Agdistis is the myth of one of the original hermaphrodites, where the Sky Father wants to make love to the Earth Mother, who is actually a stone or a rock. I've talked in the past about the way that the word Kibele comes from the root word for black stone. Kibele being this one of the original sort of Phrygian goddesses that was eventually worshipped in Rome, and of course was certainly known in Greece and places in what we think of as the Near East. And you do hear this mythology being integrated with the classical mythology, as they call it, of that area. Now, the Agdistis podcast, I think, is a really, really great one. I do my best on all podcasts, but that one I found, what happens a lot of times when I'm doing a podcast is I have a set of notes. I have, the introductory information. If we're discussing a myth, I will have the text of that myth and I will be talking about that myth. But then as I'm going through the podcast, it's very informal. That's why I don't write a script in advance, because as I'm going through it, I start to make certain connections. And as I'm reading through the text of this, I'm saying, whoa, wait a minute. There's so much to this. And the root of the Chthonia podcast, one of the core questions that I have is, what is threatening about femininity, particularly dark femininity? Why, for example, feminine sexuality, why is that something that a lot of cultures feel they have to have under control? Like, what's the need to control that? Why do we unconsciously and archetypally feel that we need to do that? I mean, people will give all kinds of ostensible legal reasons, or they might give scriptural reasons or biblical reasons or something like that. But it's not, but that's really, I said, when we have things like that, there's something else behind it. There's something else at the core of what that is. Something archetypal and unconscious, something collectively unconscious that is affecting the situation. Now, one of the things I've been doing, now again, this is not necessarily new to me. This is sort of more refresher material, but I have been finishing up a course on grief counseling. And this uses some very traditional kind of humanist approaches. And also, and one of the things that the professor of this course was talking about was, she was talking about, they always start out with your basic definitions, and talking about the 4 different approaches to therapy as they are in our modern construct. So, I mean, there's actually more than 4 approaches, but the first 4 approaches that she mentions are psychodynamics. She mentions this sort of human-centered approach, as they call it. She talks about the behavioral approach, or the behaviorist approach. And then you also have things like the cognitive approach, cognitive behavioral therapy approach. There's a couple of, there's one other one that focuses on mindfulness, and I'm not remembering the name of it right now. But what's interesting about all these approaches is that all of them, except for the psychodynamic, and the psychodynamic they define in terms of Freud and not Jung, okay? It's strictly Freudian in practice, if people are using it in clinical practice, are that none of them focus on the idea of a collective unconscious. None of them focus, in fact, some of them don't focus on the past at all, except maybe with respect to your childhood. For example, behaviorism is one of those psychologies that talks about you as a tabula rasa, that you are born as a blank slate, and your environment is just what's impressed upon you. And these approaches, this is one of the reasons I've never become a licensed therapist. And people have often asked me about that, because I actually did work at a place where just one of the perks of the job would have been that I could have gotten my master's in counseling for free. But as soon as I started to delve into any aspect of those courses, I was immediately, I'm not going to lie to you, I was horrified by it. I just feel like the approach that's supposed to be very human is not very human at all. Ultimately, it doesn't. I've seen so many people who I know who have, or know, or just have met or know of, maybe people, I'm not necessarily talking about people I'm close to, but people I have known or encountered who have been through therapy and who've been through lots of therapy, okay? And these are people, from what I know about them, have been through a lifetime of things and don't ever seem to really get better. Yeah, actually, I can think of one person who was rather close to me who went into therapy and who had certain issues that I knew about, okay? And when this person went to a therapist for like 6 months, I'm like, the therapist never, ever picked up on some of these very obvious issues. And I'm not talking about something deeply archetypal or unconscious or hidden. I'm talking about right in your face, up front, things that are very much addressed. And again, I'm not saying too much about it because I don't want to really talk about that person or that person's issue. I don't want to give anybody hints about what kind of those issues are, especially if they get the sense of who that person was. But let's just say this person had some issues that are very, very commonly dealt with. The therapist never had any idea that they had this issue, and I see that a lot where it's just there's certain problems, and the therapist. I mean, sometimes you have very good therapists who do pick up on these things, but therapy is one of those things you can go over and over and over again, and really. Certainly from an insurance perspective, the only thing that those therapists focus on are techniques for managing stress or techniques for, some of them are quick fixes. Things like cognitive behavioral therapy apparently do take a lot of time, but it's all based on the rational mind. And to me, I'm like, no, I simply do not and cannot agree that these things are simply cognitive, rational, or simply chemical. The chemistry, I think, is a bodily response to something that is going on, either an external stimuli or it has to do with something that is going on unconsciously. Because to me, the more I've gone through life, now obviously we all start with our own theories. We go to school, we go to grad school, we go to even as undergraduates, we start there. You might go in if you are studying a lot of these subjects. Like I was a religious studies major. I was also an English lit major. I double majored. And you come in and you read things. And of course, when you're in your 20s, you have your own set of ideas about how things are. But what I have found over the years is that the psychoanalytic viewpoint, which has now kind of been pushed out of most of therapeutic practice, shall we say. There are people who engage in it, but generally, for example, if you wanted to go to a Jungian therapist, insurance would not pay for that. That is considered to be something kind of outside. Well, even though the Jungian therapists do have to be licensed like other therapists, but they're not. It's generally not a kind of thing that is supported by your insurance. If you needed to go. And this focus on the medical and on the chemical and on the quick fix approach, or the coping strategy approach, I guess that's the best way to put it, really leaves us alienated, or doesn't. It just kind of we end up going in an endless loop of coping, in the same way that a lot of medicine is about managing symptoms and not about really addressing the underlying problem. And I remember, I think I was in Oxford. I was at a presentation on this was a Christian psychotherapist who was talking about this positivist approach. We're not going to focus on the past. We just want that person to move forward. And I raised my hand. I said, how the heck can you move forward if you have not addressed the past? Do you think the past is just going to go away and not come up over and over again? Because it does. The stuff that we think we've dealt with and put to bed, if we really haven't dealt with it and put it to bed, it's going to come back. And it may not come back in the same exact form. If it's, say, a relationship thing, then, okay, maybe you've gotten out of one relationship, but then the next one's going to be a revisiting of that. It's a thing that happens. There's this constant recycling and revisiting of material. And then so that's why I always tend to think of Jung's perspective, and this is a perspective I use in my own coaching, is first of all, you have your personal unconscious, you have your personal memories, you have things that, your own experiences, your own traumas, your own nostalgia for things, whatever your life experience is, and how that has influenced what your current script is, particularly, this is what we have in the personal unconscious. And yes, some therapy really only goes to that level, if anything. If they're looking at your past, they're just looking at, okay, well, what were your set of experiences? And that is an important component of things for sure. But we never look at the archetypal material that's behind it, that collective material that mythology talks about. And this is the kind of imagery that we see in dreams, for instance. It's the kind of imagery that is part of world religions. It's the kind of imagery that is part of mythologies and stories about how things came to be, because it has a lot to do with origins. And this story of Agdistis is part of one of those origin stories. And the more I'm reading into it, now mind you, I was familiar with this story before. This wasn't a new story to me. I definitely, I definitely had seen this and, before. But somehow as I was reading through it, there was just certain connections that were being made to me. And I talked a lot about those in the podcast. And I think for people who are interested in masculine feminine issues, people who are interested in LGBTQ issues, or the idea of male and female role, people who consider themselves non-binary or gender fluid, all of this ties in with this kind of mythology. And this mythology tells us a lot about why this seems to be an issue for people. And I feel like, okay, maybe we're getting closer to the idea of why is femininity so threatening in particular, but why is also people who society, like what we'll call a heteronormative society, when they feel like they go outside of their role, why is that also considered to be so threatening? Why is that something like, no, we need to put people in their place? We can't let women have reproductive rights over their body. We can't have this, we can't have that. We can't allow gay people rights. We can't. This all comes from this fear of that really connects back to what we see in the Agdistis myth. Now, whether or not this is the first example of this in any kind of mythical history, who knows? I'm not suggesting that it necessarily is. There could be older stories and older myths. There's certainly a Hittite myth that is quite similar, and so which one came first? Who knows? But it is fairly often acknowledged that the Phrygian goddesses, the Cybele cult, and some of those great Mother Magna Mater cults are some of the oldest. They're some of the oldest in our civilizations. We do see other, we see certain examples, but the ones that we at least have a written account of, these seem to be at least among the oldest, okay, and the oldest beliefs. So what do I want to talk about there? I don't want to reiterate what I've discussed in the podcast. I, of course, want people to listen to the podcast, so definitely check that out. But let me just restate the myth for you very, very quickly if you've not heard it before. And of course, the podcast just came out this morning, so maybe you've not had a chance to listen to it. And the myth of Agdistis, there's actually several variations on it, okay? But mainly, there's the idea that a sky father, who is sometimes identified with Jupiter, if you're talking about the Roman version, sometimes identified with Zeus, and in other cases, just simply a Phrygian sky god, okay? Regardless, we are talking about a sky god. Pausanias' version in the Roman is probably one of the most common ones, although there's, as Theoia.com points out, there's some weirdness about about Pausanias' version, namely in that he chooses Zeus for this mythology rather than Uranus, or Uranus, as we would say, who is the original sky god. So the question then becomes, okay, so the story is that the sky father, whether it be Zeus, Jupiter, some other deity, that whoever they fall in love with the Earth Mother, and the Earth Mother is formed as a rock. Okay, now we can just think about it as the fact that the Earth is a giant rock, right? But so he desires the Earth Mother, and so but he can't. This is interesting though. He can't mate with her, maybe because she is a rock. He can't mate with her, so his seed is spilled on the ground. Okay, and from this, a being comes out. Now, sometimes this rock is connected to Cybele. Sometimes this rock is connected to Agdis, a being called Agdis, and so, or sometimes it's just referred to as mother of the gods, or mother of the earth, or something like that. So, okay, so the child that is born when this seed falls on a rock, because this happens in mythology, you actually have to have intercourse with anybody. A seed just has to fall somewhere and boing, something is born. But of course we are dealing with gods and not people. So what's born is Agdistis. And Agdistis is a hermaphrodite. And it is referred to by Pausanias as a daemon, not referred to as a god. Later on, the Agdistis is referred to as a goddess, as we'll explain in a moment. But initially, it's a daemon. So it's a daemonic spirit. It's a numinous force, okay, an intermediary force of some kind, not necessarily equated with a god. But this being was dual-sexed, so had both sets of organs. And this being was, okay, in Pausanias versions, it just says the gods feared this being and therefore castrated it. Okay, now apologies to the men who might be watching this, but there's a lot to this, okay, the whole idea. And depending on the version that you read, that discarded member, shall we say, becomes either an almond tree or a pomegranate tree. And the idea is that Nana, who is the daughter of the river god, goes to this tree, takes its fruit, and depending on the version, she either puts it in her bosom or she puts it in her womb. Maybe they're actually kind of meant to be the same kind of thing. And then she finds, well, it says she puts it in her bosom, it disappears, and then suddenly she's pregnant. And her father, the river god, is not happy about this, so, when the child is born, wants the child, exposed and gotten rid of, and eventually she does, and the child ends up being raised by a goat. But in any case, there's this idea of Agdistis as being dual-sexed, having their member removed, so now they're just female and not male and female. And the male member becomes this tree. And this tree ends up impregnating the river god's daughter, and then produces Attis. Okay. Now, this is where it gets kind of interesting, because Agdistis is sometimes identified with goddess Cybele, okay, or I think Kybele is, I think, the way that like Jake Stratton used to say, he would say Kybele, but Kybele would she had so she's sometimes identified with Agdistis, mainly because in this mythology you see Cybele and Attis as a pair. In the Agdistis mythology, Agdistis is enamored of Attis. So you have a child who is the child of this almond tree, which is the male side of Agdistis, and Nana. And now as this child's growing up, it becomes the lover of the female part of Agdistis. Okay, so this can be a little bit confusing, because there's something vaguely incestuous about it. Now, as I've said, in pretty much all of Greek mythology, incest is most definitely a thing. Zeus and Hera are brother and sister, and they're also husband and wife. Cronus and Rhea were brother and sister, and they were also husband and wife. This is not unusual, because again, you're not talking about people. I make a lot of this in Morrigan Timelines about how the Morrigan figure in there behaves very in ways that are often considered to be rather scandalous and taboo, but it's because, well, it doesn't matter. She's not subject to human taboos. Neither are the gods. Okay, and what ends up happening is, and again, this seems to be an entirely lust-driven kind of relationship. So the king of Pausanias, King Midas, hears about Attis, doesn't really tell anybody about this relationship, but then when he gets drunk and finally does tell, then the King Midas says, "Oh, this is not civilized. This is not comely for a young man like yourself, an attractive young man like yourself." Because of course Attis is supposed to be very, very beautiful, to be, to do this. So he says, what ends up? So he says, "Okay, you're going to marry one of my daughters." And so they have this wedding feast. Now, there's different versions of this. Like the word, like again, whether you're talking about Cybele or whether you're talking about Agdistis, there's the idea. One version says that the Earth Mother knew it was not fortuitous for Attis to marry, so she intervened. Another was that Agdistis or Cybele is filled with a jealous rage and thus shows up at the wedding. Regardless of the version, either the Earth Mother and Agdistis or Cybele or just Agdistis, in any case, whatever version it is, shows up at this wedding and it drives Attis mad, and he actually cuts his own member off. Okay, and then basically there's sort of like a bloodbath, this funeral. Wedding, actually. I just said funeral. Kind of interesting, the wedding funeral thing. But yes, it's actually this bloodbath. And then Agdistis regrets what she's done. She wants the sky god, whether it's Jupiter or Zeus or whoever, to bring Attis back to life, but he won't do it. But he does allow that the body does not decay. And this is the first example of what we call a dying and resurrecting vegetation god myth. Now, that mythology is critical because it's the mythology that defines a lot of what we've believed in Western culture, namely the cult of Jesus Christ that says that Christ dies and is reborn. And this is a motif that is not unique to that situation. What's unique is that you are taking allegedly a real person. I say allegedly a real person because I don't know whether Jesus Christ was a real person or whether Jesus Christ is a construct that comes out of the syncretism of a lot of different things in Rome in that time, maybe attributed to a certain figure. Maybe he was a real figure. Obviously, within Christian mythology or Christian belief, they say yes, he was a real person. I would say there's a debate on that, so I would just leave that in question. But if we just say that Jesus was a real person, then we could say, okay, well, that would be the first time that you applied this to a living person. But the mythology is not new. It's a very, very old mythology, and a lot of it has to do with regeneration. It has to do with the regeneration of the earth, and also the way in which life and death work. There's so many pieces to this. So, okay, now the Cybele and Attis, or Agdistis and Attis story is not the only one where we have a male figure, a beautiful male figure, who is born under some kind of circumstances that are taboo or maybe not considered in the natural order of things in the way that we would assume. And that child it follows the hero myth pattern. In the hero myth pattern, you have a hero who is always, for some reason, a threat to some male figure. So in the case of Attis, he was a threat to Sangarius, who's the river god, tells Nana, no, get rid of this child and expose it. He wants to kill the child, but isn't able to, or tries to starve Nana to death. But the Earth Mother sustains her, so she has the baby, and then he makes her get rid of the baby. So there are other myths that are similar in nature, although there may be some variants. For example, the Aphrodite and Adonis myth. This starts with a figure called Myrrha. And Myrrha is someone who manages to insult Aphrodite. And so Aphrodite, she gets back at people by either making them unfaithful or making them commit incest. That's why you don't make Aphrodite annoyed. That's how she does things. That's how she rolls. So Myrrha is made to fall in love with her father, who is the king. And with the help of her nursemaid, she manages to somehow secrete herself disguised into the bedroom or something, and manages to have sex with her father. And of course, then she becomes pregnant, but then the father finds out. And of course, then she's being chased down because she's going to probably be killed and the child with her. So as she's fleeing, she, begs the gods to help her, and then she is turned into a myrrh tree. Okay, that's where we have myrrh from Myrrha. So from that union, the child that comes born out of the bottom of the tree later on is Adonis. And we always associate Adonis, that's a term we associate with men who are beautifully attractive. Man's considered to be an Adonis, right? Someone who's very, very, very attractive, very beautiful. So we have this Adonis figure, and so when Adonis is born, Adonis is the product of the incest of Myrrha and her father. Okay. Then Aphrodite, who's kind of overseeing this whole thing, takes this beautiful child and gives it to Persephone in the underworld and says, hey, take care of him for now. And then when the child grows up, he's absolutely beautiful, and Persephone's just taken with him. So again, you have this idea of someone who is at least acting as a mother figure or is somehow connected in that way, who's in love with this beautiful male child. But then Aphrodite and Persephone quarrel over who gets to have the child. Like Aphrodite said, hey, I gave him to you for safekeeping. She's like, well, I mean, I was the one taking care of him, so he's mine. So then there's a dispute, and then similar to the Hades and Persephone myth, there's a discussion as to how long basically Adonis has to spend some time with Persephone and some time with Aphrodite. So, but he chooses to spend only 3 months of the year with Persephone. Basically, it's 3 and 3, and he can pick the other 6 months for himself. So he decides to spend them with Aphrodite, so she gets him 9 months out of the year because he likes being in the upper world. It's nicer than the underworld, right? So so they run and play together, and similarly to the way Attis and Agdistis do, or Attis and Cybele do, and he ends up getting killed by a wild boar. Aphrodite knows this is coming. She tries to stop him, but he does anyway. So to be killed by a boar, that's another. I don't know. There's something about that as well. There's kind of there's a little bit of an association there. I'm just trying to think. I feel like there's like a sort of a connecting association with the boar imagery there. But in any case, Adonis dies, and Aphrodite basically resurrects him in the Adonis flower. What happens with Attis is his resurrection is through violets. The violet flower is supposed to be the recurring body, the body of Attis returned. So they're beautiful men who die and come back as these flowers that continually are reborn. So yeah, this is this cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. So out of the blood of the slain male hero, out of the slain sorry, my brain is like short-circuiting today. Out of the body of the hero, there's this rebirth. There's this rebirth in the earth. Okay. So, and we also see this in Ishtar and Tammuz, although in this case, Tammuz ends up being sent to the underworld for being too fancy and dressed, while Ishtar is in the underworld, so she lets him be dragged down to the underworld. But again, there's a cycle with him. He's another god who dies and is sort of resurrected in that way. And then Isis and Osiris is another version of this, where Osiris is killed by his brother and his body is cut up into pieces, and then Isis has to find him and kind of resurrect him and put him back together again. So we have these myths of death and resurrection, and the Cybele and Attis myth is another. Now, in some versions, Attis just castrates himself, and then he becomes a servant of the goddess Cybele, and he becomes the model for the Galli, who are the eunuchs. Okay, now the eunuch imagery is very, very interesting here, because eunuchs are there's a verse, and it's Matthew 19:12, that talks about becoming eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. And what's interesting about this is that this is actually one of the verses that is pointed to when they talk about the celibacy of priests. The idea is that they're eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. Now, they're not literally eunuchs. The church doesn't make them, castrate themselves or whatever. But the fact that they are living without sex, it's like they are effectively castrated in some way. And the Jonas pointed out in answer to Job, he's like, yeah, but that's actually a reference to the Cybele cult. It's a reference to the Galli, who were part of this Cybele Magna Mater cult that was in Rome. In fact, the Romans were pretty horrified by them, because they thought, why would a man do that to himself on purpose? But they referred to them as half men, or men. In other words, there was the idea that there's almost returning to a hermaphroditic state, or to the state of Agdistis, where you're a man, you're sort of a man, you have both like masculine and feminine elements, but your masculine element's been taken away. Okay? And these are all cults associated with the Earth Mother. So first of all, for me, I thought the implication of the fact that the Earth Mother may have originally started, at least in some versions of this myth, as a hermaphrodite. And in one of those versions, okay, there is the reason that that Agdistis is castrated is because he is destroying the earth. He has no the hermaphrodite has no regard for anything in earth or heaven, and is just absolutely going about like bringing destruction everywhere. So the gods figure out, okay, what are we going to do about this? And so Dionysus gets him drunk, and while he's asleep, ties a rope between his member and his foot, and so when he goes to stand up, he pulls his own member off. And there's another story that this is similar to, in a way, and that is the story of Uranus and Gaia. And this is the original myth by Hesiod, in Hesiod's Theogony, of how the universe was created. And the universe is created by Uranus and Gaia. Well, you have the void, you have chaos, right? And out of chaos comes the original five. You have Tartarus, Erebus, Nyx, Gaia, and Eros. These are the first five to come out of chaos. And it is Gaia who ends up, and Gaia gives birth to Aether, which is like the blue sky, and then gives birth to Uranus and several of the Titans. So what happens is that then Uranus mates with her. He's the sky god mating with the earth mother. Okay? Sky god mates with the earth mother. And the results of that union, I mean, yes, they do bear a lot of the Titans, who represent these sort of very primal forces. But they also bear things like the Hekatoncheires, which are the 100-handers. They bear all these giants and things that Uranus is horrified by. Now, it's important to remember what Jung and then, of course, Erich Neumann after him had said about masculine and feminine. And it doesn't just come from them. I mean, I'm thinking of Neumann's essay called Fear of the Feminine. And you also see this in this idea, okay, in Roman grammar as well, like Varro says this. The Roman grammarian Varro also says this, and says the idea that everything associated with the sky is masculine and everything associated with the earth is feminine. And again, you can, and this was the way Varro said that, so that's why language is construed, like things earth-centered are feminine in gender as far as the words go, because words have a gender, case, and number. So feminine words have to do with the earth and masculine words have to do with the sky. Now, actually, from a strictly linguistic standpoint, this is actually not true. But as I pointed out in the intro to my book, I said this is a really interesting concept because, and it was the Romans, in fact, who were the ones who were really strict about linguistics, about if you're talking about something or someone who's female, considered female, you take, even if it's a masculine word, you make it feminine, and vice versa. They were the ones to do that. They were very much enforcing that separation. And the thing is, now, if we think about the separation between male and female, if you think of sky and earth coming together as a merging of masculine and feminine, okay, then what happens in the Hesiod myth? Well, Uranus, because he doesn't like the children the guy is producing, tries to stuff them back into the earth. As Dr. Phelan used to say, she would say, yeah, just imagine being a woman giving birth and having your spouse trying to shove the baby back into your womb. She was, let's just say, not very pleased about this. So she gathers the children she has and she says, who's going to save me from your father? And Kronos says, I'll do it. And so she gives Kronos the sickle. And how does Kronos do it? Exactly what you think. He takes his father's member off. It falls into the sea, it foams, and out of the foam comes Aphrodite, goddess of love. Do you see that image of her like floating to the shore in a conch shell? Yeah, she was just born out of the bloody genitals of Uranus. Sorry to be graphic, but that's what happens. Her name, in fact, means foam born. And so she comes out, and also there's a number of giants that are born out of this. I mean, but this is what comes out of this. And after that, earth and sky are separate. Because the idea is that merging of earth and sky was not only producing things that were monstrous, but also was terrifying in some way. I mean, it was a union that was becoming that wasn't sustainable. And it's very interesting, as I pointed out, that the one who separates earth and sky is is Kronos. Kronos is the god of time. And as I point out to my myth students, a lot of creation mythology is about how you come into the field of time. How do you come to experience life and death, particularly? Why does death happen? A lot of it addresses that question. And so there's the idea that there was this unity of masculine and feminine, and we see it in other cultures too. Like I've mentioned, Sri Ardhanarishwara in India, in the Shiva Shakti myth, where you have a united male-female figure. And here you're seeing it as and actually in the mythology of the flood. What it says in the Bible, if you read Genesis, I think it's still in Genesis 5. I always want to say it's Genesis 6. I know the Noah story kind of spreads over those two. But Yahweh decides he's going to flood the earth because the Nephilim walked upon the earth, and they were very destructive. And these were supposed to be the children of angels mating with human women. Okay, and it actually says in the Bible, these can be equated with the heroes of old. So we're talking about the legendary demigods who were like the great generals in battle. And I talk about that in the podcast. Like Achilles type people, who have a immortal parent, one mortal parent and one immortal parent. Okay. And so they're almost superhuman and unnatural in their abilities. And similarly, the idea of the hermaphrodite was a being that, when united, was too powerful. And in fact, Plato talks about him as being more powerful than the gods. And at least in that one myth, you see the same destructive energy that you see in the story of the Nephilim. So the idea is almost that a being that is both male and female, and fully both, somehow is going to destroy order and bring things back to chaos. Okay, and it's interesting because with Kronos, he does this. Once you have time, now you're working in ordering principles. Okay, you're working in measurement. Time is a measurement. I mean, we look at the rising and setting of the sun. We use that as our measurement for how long a day is. Right? And we break it down into minutes and hours, and then we have time zones and all this stuff. But we have a very strong concept of time, and we have a concept of difference. We're not seeing things as a unified field of some kind. We know difference, and we measure distances and differences, and we do things in that way. We measure things both literally and figuratively, and that is the way that we order things. That's the way that we keep things under control. And so there is this idea that when masculine and femininity in either role acts in a way that is more hermaphroditic. So a woman who acts more like what socially was expected to be of a man, or a man who acts more of what was socially expected to be of a woman, or something like that, or somebody who is intersexed, or somebody who where you have this idea that you have somebody who is identified as one gender taking on characteristics of another. That was considered to be the terror there of kind of returning to this state of destruction. Now, if we look at succession mythology, succession mythology is interesting because a lot of it has to do with fear of a child, and then this is in hero myths too, of a child that is going to be more powerful than the father. Kronos, who is the one who separated earth and sky, now becomes king of creation. But as all his children are born, and these were largely the 12 Olympians, and he started swallowing them immediately as soon as they were born. Time was devouring them right away. So this was really kind of a state of ongoing death, really. There was no growth. There was no ability for any growth. Now, Rhea, his wife, is a goddess of fertility. She tends to be equated with Cybele. And so Rhea is just like, I've had enough of this. So she ends up giving him a stone to swallow and spares Zeus, who is the next successor to being the sky god. So Cronus is the next god, then Zeus becomes the god after him. So, and then Zeus rises up against his father in this mythology, and he ends up defeating him and becoming king of the gods. And similarly, when Zeus is threatened, in the case of Metis, goddess of wisdom, it was said that he has sex with Metis, but then when she is about to give birth, the prophecy is, well, that child's going to be greater than you, so he swallows Metis, and he gives birth to the child himself, and that child is Athena. So it's like he somehow manages to subvert or co-opt whatever that power is, whatever that feminine power is, for these more kind of masculine oriented things. We associate with Athena. Athena's a war goddess, right? Although, as I've said, war is to some degree a feminine thing. But it's interesting because it's about this rather complicated interplay between masculine and feminine. Ultimately, the idea that somehow when both are united in one person, that person can be a threat. Now, that said, there's another point of view, what they call the Theoesoteris, which are the savior gods. And among these were Artemis and Apollo. Okay, and Agdistis is another one. And it's almost the idea that these, when you pair the masculine and feminine together, that this also has a saving quality to it. So it's interesting how you have that flip in thinking. Because on the one hand, there's the idea that uniting the two is somehow going to launch us into chaos. And then there's another view that suggests that this is somehow the uniting of the two is what saves us. There could be some hints about this in the agricultural mythologies, because one of the things that's been pointed out about these male figures that are castrated, it's a little bit like the crops that grow out of the earth and then have to be cut. Sacrifice was a big thing among agricultural cults, particularly. Campbell has a whole thing on it, and I can't remember all the details of all of them, but I know certainly he had talked about agricultural cults being the ones that tended to practice human sacrifice in particular, because the idea was somehow that shedding of blood was something that rejuvenated the earth. And that there has to be that kind of bloodshed, like that. If the growth, if the crops, if the wheat or whatever is equated with the male figure in some way, it has to be cut down. This may also tie into the mythology of Chrysaor. A lot of people, they know the story of Perseus and Medusa. They know that Medusa, she looks at you, you turn to stone. Perseus, the hero, is sent to behead her and bring the head back to the I'm not remembering his name right now. But in any case, the king of the island, who's been going after his mother, and of course he wants to protect his mother, but the king decides to try to get rid of him by saying, "Oh yeah, go get the head of Medusa for me," because I guess he can't afford a gift as great as the other people. So Perseus goes and he accomplishes his task. But when Medusa is beheaded, out of her neck comes two beings. She bears two children that are children of Poseidon. Okay, because she's had sex with Poseidon. At least in this version, they've mated, and Athena has punished her by turning her into a gorgon. Okay, so she was a priestess of Athena, or at least compared her beauty to Athena, or something like that. So the two children are the winged horse Pegasus, which most people are familiar with Pegasus. A lot of people are not familiar with Chrysaor, and Chrysaor is a fully grown warrior boy who is golden in color and has golden armor and a golden sword, which is kind of weird when you think about it. I mean, it's like, why would Medusa? This is the product of Poseidon and Medusa, okay? But it's been said that the appearance of Chrysaor suggests that he is like a golden sheaf of wheat, in a way, and it's that wheat that ends up being cut down. So the idea actually of the castration is almost like the cutting down of the crop. And that really gets down to a real core idea about these death and rebirth myths. And that is that you have that life requires death. Okay. You cannot separate the two. The two are connected. And as I mentioned in a podcast, I didn't do it for this. I did a podcast for Patreon only on the sexuality of death. But there's a connection there. There's a very intimate connection there between life and death. And that death is always required for life. This is actually the idea behind sacrifice, generally speaking, if you're talking about any kind of blood sacrifice in particular. Although you could sacrifice, people could, even people putting flowers at their altar, I mean, that's a kind of sacrifice. People don't tend to think of vegetative sacrifices as sacrifices, just like they don't think of it as killing. Like they say, oh, well, I don't kill to eat. I'm like, well, Yes, we do. I mean, you are killing something. Plants are living things. I mean, just because they're not the same type of living thing as an animal doesn't mean that they're not a living thing. And so we always have to kill something in order to live. And there's almost like a core mystery in that. So there has to be like this principle of redemption that comes within that. So there's this very complicated mythology of this beautiful male who ends up representing the kind of the prosperity or the abundance that comes from the Earth Mother, okay, who is fertile and somehow is both male and female at the same time, though presents as female. There's this sort of connection here that has to do with fertility and has to do with succession and going on. But there's the idea that this boy who is the successor has to ultimately be cut down. You hear a lot about this too in more modern pagan groups, about the idea of the Holly King and the Oak King and the king being cut down in the fall and things like that. The John Barleycorn kind of stuff. Some of that is more modern stuff that people have, that I don't think necessarily can be proven to have an ancient origin, from what I understand. But at the same time, there's a motif there. There's a motif that's being played out, and that's the idea of the king that is cut down, and that's what you see in these myths. And the idea is that in cutting them down, then they receive this kind of eternal life. Because remember, we're functioning in a time period where eternal life is not a thing, okay? And their ancient beliefs, everybody always talks about the idea, like people say, well, no, that you die and your soul goes to Hades, or the Egyptians thought this and this. It's like, no, immortal life was only for certain people. Certainly in ancient Egypt, it was only for the pharaoh initially. Now, by the time you get to the coffin text period, that's much later, then immortality, or that idea of survival after death, becomes available to more people. Initially, it's only a royal thing because the pharaoh is considered to be a god, right? And so, mortality and immortality are two separate things. The Gilgamesh, they say, life the gods kept for themselves, and death they gave to mortals. And so this is when the barkeep that Gilgamesh is talking to says, live your life, enjoy it, because you don't have immortality. And that the ancients did not believe that. Like going to Hades, or going to Sheol, or going to Aralu or Kigal, any of these underworld places that we associate with the Near East, was not immortality. You were going to a kind of a gloomy place. Like there's a part of you that it's like a place of ancestors, and it's where like the shade of you or the memory of you lives on, but it's not in this world. This is why ancestral rites become important. This is the way that you remember the past, and you continue the line into the future. And I think that this, at least in terms of human societies, is the core of what's threatening about these mythologies, because as I've said before, a lot of what we're seeing, even about the fates, is about ancestry and ancestral line. So women's sexuality is important because the idea is that women are the ones who are providing the heirs and providing the successors. So obviously you don't want the woman, or really the man either, getting involved in a situation where they may produce something that may be destructive of that line. This is why you also have taboos against things like cannibalism and incest. Psychologically speaking, cannibalism and incest are both, they're both taboos, obviously. They're major taboos. Most of us, we hear those words and we go, you recoil instantly. And there's a good reason for that, because you are, because they both are things that are destructive. When I teach mythology, I teach about the Theban saga with respect to incest. That's the saga that includes the Oedipus myth, okay? And how when you end up having incest, it ends up destroys the family from within, because you're keeping it in the family. You're not allowing the lineage to grow. You're not having the immortality of the line. You're cutting it off. Similarly with cannibalism, the stories you see of cannibalism in Greek mythology, which I connect to the Messenian saga of the House of Atreus and Agamemnon, which ends up in a total disaster with Orestes being forced to kill his mother, after his mother kills his father. It's the idea of the corruption that happens when you try to stop that succession. Kronos devouring his children, and then the great war with the Titans and what happens then. And then the destruction with that. And then in this case with the House of Atreus, which starts with Tantalus killing Pelops, his son, and feeding him to the gods and getting confined to Tartarus forever as a punishment. But Pelops is resurrected. But Pelops immediately starts to do things that are, violating hospitality rules and things like that. And then by the time you get to Atreus and Thyestes, they're fighting over kingship. And when Atreus gains the kingship finally, after he was cheated out of it initially, he basically takes Thyestes' son, his nephew, kills him, cooks him, and then serves him to his father at a feast. In which case Thyestes curses him. So there's the idea of the father or the uncle who devours the child, devours the son, or devours the nephew, which is the idea of, that instead of allowing that power that were represented by the male in this case to expand, instead they're trying to curtail it and say, no, I'm going to keep it to myself. Okay, I'm going to take your power and keep it to myself by ingesting you, by taking your blood. And that is not something that is, it's not generally not an acceptable, it's not an acceptable thing in way of human thinking, that kind of thing, because it degenerates the line. Now you might then ask, well, what about the mythology of Jesus Christ, or the idea of the Eucharist and the transubstantiation, where you're supposed to be eating the body and blood, eating body and drinking the blood of Jesus Christ? Well, remember, first of all, when you're talking about that, you are talking about a man who is supposed to be a deity, a God-man. But you also have to remember that the mythology of Christianity is all about conquering death. Okay? So, in a way, it's almost... And this kind of relates more back to the sacrifice of the totem animal, in a way. Or the way in which one is sacrificed to expiate really guilt. He's sort of like the scapegoat. He takes the role of Azazel as the scapegoat. And he is... it's like the sins are put on him, and then by the consuming of that flesh, ritualistically speaking, through this magical process called transubstantiation, that one is imbuing the divine in the same way that the Titans had imbued the divine essence of Dionysus by killing and eating him. And of course he is resurrected too. He's the other dying and resurrecting god, probably the one that's the closer model to Jesus than some of the others, although again, this is a mythical motif that is not new in those cultures. So, I guess the summary here, there's so much to say about this, but the idea is that we live in an ordered world. Okay, we live in a world that has order, and the way that order has been considered to be maintained, at least according to mythologies, is through separation, through discrimination, in the sense of the sword of the intellect, the discriminating intellect. And I don't mean that in a negative way, like when you discriminate against somebody. I mean in the sense of I discriminate between what's right and what's wrong, for example. And that's often represented with the sword as well. The sword discriminates, it cuts. And it also becomes a phallic representation too. It's that which cuts. It's that thing that allows us to live in a space where we can have order and can have control, and to blur those lines or to take that away in that viewpoint is to invite a return to chaos and invite destruction of the society and of the ancestral lineages. Okay? So, mind you, I'm not suggesting that this is a justification for, dealing with people who are, don't follow the cisgender heterosexual norms, because I'm not saying that at all, actually. My point has always been that you have to, that was the way that we've been doing things. That's really what's collective. That seems to be what's hardwired in the collective unconscious. That's why I spent a whole lot of time initially talking about the collective and the ways in which we deal with our psychology, because we don't realize that these kinds of myths that are so ingrained in the collective unconscious, how much of an impact they have. And they have almost an autonomy, like a life of their own. It's not like we can just simply overturn them. That doesn't mean that when when they are no longer a structure that supports the society that we're in, that doesn't mean that they don't need to be torn down. This is why I think the destruction needs to come in, because society has to be developed in a new way, one that perhaps moves back more towards that unity, because that separation, rather than something that's been maintaining us as a species, it's actually now starting to destroy us. So I feel like this is why, regardless of where you're coming from, whether you believe in divine feminine gods or not, whether there's still this idea. This is why the idea of the dark feminine comes in, because it's this aspect of the feminine that is rebellious. And similarly, even a rebellious masculine is said to be identified with the feminine in that sense. And people feel that it's putting us in a space that is going to somehow make us lose order, lose control, and perhaps be destructive. That's why they always talk about it with family values, like it's going to destroy the whole family structure. But we are not living in ancient tribal societies where the maintaining of the tribal line might have been a very important thing. We live in a very, very different world, and we need to change and adapt to what that world is. So, now we don't entirely know what everything looks like, but I feel like a lot of the ways in which people now are dealing with gender, the fact that people are, more open about homosexual relationships, that people are more open about, being non-binary or gender fluid. The fact that these things are coming into our culture, people who say, well, that's woke culture and we want to get rid of it. It's like, no, what you're actually afraid of, that's when people talk about it. You're afraid of the breakdown of that idea of succession. You're afraid that violating that taboo is going to move us into a new space. The problem is we are moving into a new space, and we're not conscious of it. We're not, we're stuck in between, really. And there's people who want to go back, and you can't go back. We've gone too far to go back. You have to go this way. But that means you have to negotiate the fact that, okay, something here is breaking down so that something new can take its place. And that's going to be something that is going to be more unified, and it's going to, because I feel like we are at a stage where we need to be uniting those masculine and feminine energies and not focusing on the separateness, because focusing, that's why I think Eastern belief has become more prominent, because that says the idea of separateness is an illusion caused by the goddess Maya, that Maya is illusion, and that really everything is not separate. And that's sort of the way that we have to start thinking about things, because if we don't, the more that we understand about the universe, the more we understand about interdimensionality, the more we understand that there's a whole context of things, which neuroscience also supports, by the way, that are beyond what our brains can handle. Part of this just requires that we find a way to merge those energies in ourselves. We have to, when you have people who are very staunchly, quote unquote, traditional, it's because they are, they're afraid of that kind of merging between the masculine and feminine. And there are people who are usually people who are very much out of balance. So the man who has to be very, surrounds himself with guns and is, I'm a man's man and this and that. That's a person who's not comfortable with their femininity. Similarly, you can have women who might, follow a certain model, or might just be living for having their children, or different things, to a point that they are not, or they are giving of themselves to a point that now they are not necessarily comfortable with their masculinity. They might not be somebody who wants to stand up for themselves, or they're not. They may be more passive and prefer to let, say, the men in their life make the decisions for them. And some men think that's great, but that's actually masculine and femininity out of balance. Within yourself, you need to be balanced in both of those aspects. So somebody who is more, a woman who's more independent, more aggressive, also has to embrace needs to embrace their vulnerability, because otherwise, then you don't want to be at a point where you're looking at everything from a clinical, rational, cold perspective, and leaving the whole gamut of intuition, emotional intelligence, empathy, compassion, like leaving all of that out of it because, it doesn't make sense analytically or logically. Or we only pretend to embrace it because we say, well, that's a nice value we should have. It can't be, there has to be a merging of those things because we are so deeply disconnected from nature that now that pattern that we observed that was sustaining us is now probably actually starting to destroy us. So certainly, there's certainly a lot more that can be, there's always going to be a lot more that can be said on this topic. This would be a fun topic for a course or something. Or some kind of a talk that we could have with myself and probably with others as well. So that might be something I could think about putting together in the future, in the near future. So anyway, that's I think about all I have time for today. Thank you if you've joined me. It's still saying we're telling people that you've started a video, and it looks to me like there might be 2 people on, but it's not actually giving me a feed, which technology, it happens. So I do think there's some people who might be on, but for some reason Instagram is not showing you to me today because it does. I am seeing a number up here and then I'm not seeing anybody in the list. So anyway, you've joined me today. Thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate you taking the time. And like I said, anybody who may be watching this afterwards, hello to you. And of course, obviously, feel free to leave me comments either on Instagram or on YouTube about what you think about this video, or if you're on my Patreon, feel free to leave comments there as well. I hope you all have a great week, and I'll see you next week.